I hope all my American listeners had a happy and safe 4th of July. I am going to jump right into this. I know I say that every week, but it's a lot easier just to jump right in. Danniella Nickole Vian was born March 8th, 1993, in Roswell, New Mexico, to Joy Vian. Her biological father is unknown, but it didn't take her stepfather, Bill Vian, long to adopt Danniella, and she would take on Bill's surname. Danniella grew up in a military family where she was always having to start over, new schools, new friends, since Bill was in the military. Bill and Danniella had a good relationship as Danniella was growing up. However, Danniella's relationship with her mom, Joy, was anything but wholesome. Danniella spent much of her adolescent years couch hopping on friends' couches to avoid her mother. Danniella was artistic and had an interest in tattoos. While Bill was stationed at Fort Riley, an army base that is 1 hour west of the Kansas capital of Topeka, Danniella would become friends with a man named Tyler Thomas that she met while she was attending Kansas State University. Danniella and Tyler shared many similarities, such as both being of military families and that they were both adopted at young ages by their stepfathers. They also shared an interest in tattoos, such an interest that eventually they got matching tattoos that were of two tombstones that said "Together Till Death." There was no romantic interest for the two when they first met, and Tyler had followed in his father's footsteps and had also joined the military. Tyler would be deployed overseas to Iraq, and the two stayed in contact through Facebook Messenger when Tyler was deployed. When Tyler returned from his deployment, him and Danniella began a relationship, and it began as just a long-distance relationship since Danniella was living in Fort Riley and Tyler was living in Mobile, Alabama. And it wouldn't take long, and Tyler had asked Danniella to move to Mobile with him, which she obliged. And since Tyler and Danniella were young and didn't have much money, they were staying with Tyler's parents, Julie and Patrick, while they saved up money for their own place. Well, in 2013, the pair discovered they were pregnant, and this actually encouraged the couple to move out of Tyler's parents' home and get their own apartment. In December of 2013, their little girl, Cora, was born. While both Tyler and Danniella loved and cared about Cora, they were both very aware that they had brought a child into a very toxic relationship. Since Tyler was self-medicating with heroin to deal with his PTSD from his military experiences, and Danniella was self-medicating for issues of her own with an ADD medication called Vian that she had obtained without a prescription. Tyler and Danniella's relationship was a constant battle of arguments that at times would even turn physical. Since they were both aware that this was not the best environment for their daughter Cora, they felt that Cora would be best in the custody of Tyler's parents, Julie and Patrick, until the two of them could sort their relationship out. So over the next 4 years, Danniella worked different jobs in restaurants and bars in Mobile area, trying to make a living for herself, but also trying to provide for Cora. While Danniella was working on getting her life back together, Tyler was struggling to stay clean with his heroin addiction and trying to stay out of jail. Other than that, there's not much known about the couple over between 2013 and 2017, and in the fall of 2017, Danniella becomes pregnant again. And while the two were at a doctor's visit trying to figure out the time of conception, it was quickly realized that Tyler was not the father, since at the time of that Danniella would have conceived, Tyler would have been in jail and later rehab. Even though the two had an on and off again relationship, they had remained close, and Tyler vowed to support Danniella through the pregnancy until she gave the child up for adoption. By December, Danniella had started showing, and this infuriated Tyler. So to put some distance between the two, Danniella decides to move to North Carolina, where her mother Joy was living, and try to reestablish a relationship with Joy. But just after 2 weeks, she moved back to Mobile, stating that she missed Tyler and Cora. After she moved back to Mobile, Danniella gets a job at an Asian American restaurant called P.F. Chang's. And this is where she begins a friendship with Hannah Jakubowski, where many of Danniella's friendships were the result of first being coworkers. Danniella informs Hannah that she doesn't have a car, and Hannah offers to give Danniella rides to and from work, even on her days off, because Hannah only lived a few minutes away from Danniella. On June 6, 2018, Danniella goes into labor. And while Danniella is going into labor, Tyler is actually having his own issues, and he had overdosed on heroin in his car. And the EMS, they were able to resuscitate him with the drug Narcan. And once he was resuscitated, he goes to the hospital where Danniella's in labor to support her. And Danniella, she ended up giving birth to a baby boy. But since she had chose adoption, it was a couple that she had chosen from Mobile, and they were present at the birth. There's not really much known about the adoptive parents other than she was a teacher and he was a police officer, and they were willing to do an open adoption with Danniella, but she chose not to do it that way. But she did have up to 6 months. In the state of Alabama, you have 5 days to change your mind. But the couple actually gave Danniella up to 6 months to change her mind. And she left the hospital not seeing or holding the baby boy. There is allegations that Danniella had wrote a letter to the baby boy, and she'd given it to the adoptive parents to give to the baby boy when he turned 18. And later that day, Tyler had turned himself in for a parole violation. And since Danniella and Julie were really close, Danniella had called Julie to let her know that she was sore, but she was doing okay. And just 3 days later, Danniella actually went back to work at P.F. Chang's. She was bleeding really heavily, and she actually chose to rely on Narco, a painkiller prescription, but it would cause her drowsiness, but she wanted it to help her to work through the pain. Tyler and Danniella had been discussing for a while to make Julie and her husband Patrick legal guardians of Cora until the two were living a more stable and safe life for their daughter. And they were scheduled to meet with a lawyer to represent Cora's best interest. So here in Wisconsin, that is best known as a guardian ad litem. And this meeting was to take place, spoiler alert, a week after Danniella's disappearance. By July of 2018, Danniella had saved up enough money to buy a car, so she didn't have to depend on Hannah anymore to go to and from work. She was going through a dealership called Pearl Motors that catered to people that had either no credit or bad credit and did on-site financing. We have a place similar to that here in Wisconsin, and all my Wisconsin listeners, you know exactly who I'm talking about because those commercial ads are so annoying. Pearl Motors needed Danniella to get a number of documents to complete the financing, such as a recommendation from her landlord that she was reliable in paying her rent. So Danniella spent the rest of the day gathering all the required documents she needed since she was able to borrow Julie's car that day. And since Danniella was still suffering with complications and pain from giving birth just 6 weeks prior, she got back to Julie's, and she took a narco and she laid down on the couch where her and Julie began to discuss the upcoming plans for the next day. For Danniella to pick up her 2014 Chevy Cruze from Pearl Motors, first, Julie would take Danniella to the bank and then to Pearl Motors. Danniella would leave from Pearl Motors and had plans to run some errands, such as getting Cora school supplies that she planned on surprising Cora with that Thursday, since Cora had been away with her grandfather Patrick visiting family, and Danniella was going to spend that night, that Thursday, with Cora. As the two were discussing the plans, Danniella apologized to Julie that the narco was kicking in and it was making her really sleepy, and she fell asleep on the couch. So the next day, the 17th, Danniella woke up early to get ready for the day, and she wrote a list of goals that she wanted to accomplish, mostly relating to Cora, but a few financial goals as well, such as paying off a library fee, getting her bank account out of the negative, and money towards a Capital One credit card. She also noted that she wanted to get Cora's room ready, to take Cora to school every day, and to have her stay with Danniella at least 80% of the time. As Danniella and Julie headed off to the bank and the dealership, Danniella put an envelope with cash for the down payment and insurance into her satchel-type bag, and then they proceeded to go off to the bank, where Danniella would deposit the money into Julie's bank account to pay for the insurance. Since Danniella's account was in the negative, the fees would be taken from her deposit, and she wouldn't have enough for the payment. And by 11 o'clock that morning, Julie and Danniella were at Pearl Motors. Julie waits for Danniella to complete all the paperwork to pick up the keys for the Chevy Cruze. And about 10 minutes later, Pearl Motors is explaining to Danniella that their vehicles are equipped with a GPS system, and it plugs into a socket at the base of the steering column. And this GPS pings every 4 minutes while the vehicle's in motion, and it'll ping every 4 hours while the car is not in motion until the car is paid off, and then the dealership disables it. But if the GPS is disabled at any point, it'll alert the dealership, and that way the dealership is alerted and they can locate the car. And this is also so if a borrower stops making payment, they know where the car is and they can go and basically repossess it. Well, Danniella, she signs the acknowledgement of the GPS and that she won't attempt to remove it. By noon that day, Danniella and Julie waved by, and Danniella leaves Pearl Motors parking lot, and she returns home in her newly purchased car. About 20 after 4, Danniella she texts Hannah to see if Hannah's working that day, and Hannah responds pretty quickly saying that she's working till 5. About 5:30-ish, Danniella, she leaves her apartment. She goes to run her errands. First, she stops at the strip mall that is near the shops at Bel Air Mall, which is where P.F. Chang's is located at the time. And she actually bumps into a coworker, and she chats with this coworker for a few minutes, and then it's just bragging how she's relieved she finally has her own car and her own transportation. I don't believe I brought it up, but Danniella, when she was talking to Julie about their day's events, Julie was planning on going out and celebrating her milestone with friends. So that evening, after she picked her car up, she had messaged a former coworker that was now a friend of hers, Randy, after she was texting with Hannah to see if Randy was still was working that night, since she had worked with him at Hurricane Bar and Wings. Well, Randy responded and let her know that he was no longer at Hurricane Bar and Wings, and he was now working at Heroes Sports Bar and Grill in West Mobile, and that she was more than welcome to come by. But Danniella had responded saying she wasn't really comfortable going somewhere where she'd never been before. Randy replied back to her, "LOL, I hear you. Well, I'm here, not like you don't know anyone." So about 6:30, Danniella decides to go to Heroes, and she hangs out with Randy while he's working. And Randy's about 10 years her senior. And while she's there, she meets Denson White and Mallory Kentworthy. And they end up watching the MLB All-Star game. So Denson, he was in his early 40s, and Danniella didn't know him prior to this evening. And Mallory, Danniella had known of her through mutual friends. And the only reason Denson and Mallory were even there that night is they played on the softball team with Randy, and they were supposed to have a game that night, but it was canceled due to the rain. Danniella, she decides at some point she's exchanging texts with Julie, and they're talking about the local gossip. This would be the last time that Julie has any communication with Danniella. And about a minute later, Danniella's messaging Hannah saying that she hadn't seen Hannah's car at P.F. Chang's when she went to the mall earlier, but Hannah's like responding that she is at work. And Danniella tells Hannah, "Hey, I'm drinking happily at a sports bar." Well, Hannah's responding like, "Yeah, taking advantage of the freedom." And then at 8:25 p.m. that night, Danniella sends a third text to Hannah and says, "Okay, I'm going to drive now, but should I? I don't know." Well, Danniella had a few drinks, but she didn't appear to be drunk. However, no one's aware whether or not Danniella had taken a narco, and patients that take narco are warned against drinking while taking it. Around 9 p.m. that night, Denson and Danniella become Facebook friends, and Denson sends Danniella an invite to a party that he's going to be having at his place a few weeks later. And about 10-15 minutes later, Danniella, Denson, and Mallory, they decide they're going to leave Heroes and they're going to go to the Irish pub called Dublin's that's not too far away, and they're going to wait for Randy to get off of work and then meet back up with him at Ollie's, another bar, which Ollie's was closer to Danniella's apartment. So Danniella hugs Randy goodbye, and then her, Denson, and Mallory leave Heroes. And while they're at Dublin's, Danniella sends Randy 2 Facebook messages, and Randy obviously must have been busy because he didn't respond to either one of them. So about 9:15 that night, Danniella attempts to call Hannah, but Hannah's still working, so she doesn't answer the phone. Half an hour later, Danniella messages Hannah on Snapchat with a short video, and she's sitting by herself in her driver's seat of her car. And the clip isn't really anything out of the ordinary, but Hannah did note later that Danniella did appear to be a little intoxicated. And about 20 minutes later, Hannah tried to call Danniella back, and there was no answer after she received the Snapchat message. And according to Danniella's GPS records, her car didn't leave Heroes parking lot until about 5 after 10, which was actually about an hour after she had left the bar. And it's really unknown whether Danniella had stayed in her car the entire time in the parking lot, or if she had rode with someone else and returned to Heroes to retrieve her car. So there's a possibility she went with Mallory or Denson to Dublin's and came back to get her car. So 10 after 10, Danniella and Denson and Mallory, they continue hanging out at Dublin's for about 45 minutes. And then Randy messages Danniella on Facebook to let her know that he's off work and that he's going to head straight to Ollie's. So while they're all hanging, Mallory, Denson, and Danniella are hanging out at Dublin's, Mallory decides she's going to meet up with friends at a pool hall called Runway Bar. And she had planned on rejoining Danniella, Denson, and Randy at Ollie's later. But Denson, he decided he was going to go home instead of Ollie's as they had originally planned. Danniella, Denson, and Mallory, they all leave Dublin's in their own individual vehicles. And to go from Dublin's to Ollie's, it's only 2.8 miles. And when you leave the Dublin's parking lot to go to Ollie's, there's a left turn out of the parking lot. And Denson's house was the opposite direction, so he had to turn right. And according to Danniella's GPS data and the statement that Mallory would later give, Danniella actually ended up taking a right out of Dublin's, which was very odd considering Danniella actually knew that area pretty well. So Randy gets to Ollie's and he doesn't find any of them. So he calls Denson and Denson doesn't answer. So Randy just waits around waiting for them all to arrive. So while Denson is on his way home, he's not aware that Danniella is following him until he goes through an industrial area and Danniella starts flashing her headlights at him, signaling him to pull over. So the two cars, Danniella and Denson, they pull into a closed Shell station, which is really weird that they did that because there was open gas stations and a Waffle House nearby. There is a note that NBC 15, a local news station, had actually obtained and published surveillance footage, and at the request of the MPD, they were to remove the actual video, but they left the timeline of the video up. And while they're stopped, this is when Danniella lets Denson know that she's lost her phone. And Danniella actually had a habit of losing her phone. So, and this is also where Daniella's car's GPS has its final. And according to Pearl Motors, the GPS had been securely installed in an outlet underneath the steering column. So it was really highly unlikely that it accidentally became unplugged. So it was either intentionally disconnected or a fuse had blown. And at the surveillance video showed that there was one car that left the Shell station and one that stayed. And a minute later, another car pulled into the Shell station and parks. But it's such a grainy surveillance that it wasn't clear if it was the same car that left or a different one. And Danielle's, like I said, she was known for frequently losing her phones. So she would use Facebook Messenger as her primary method of communication. And Danniella was pretty sure that she'd forgotten her phone at Dublin's. So Denson said that he'd go back and get it. But at first he called her phone in an attempt to locate it. And he used it via Facebook Messenger because Danniella either hadn't memorized her phone number or she was in an intoxicated state that she couldn't remember it. And he had left a voicemail. But in this voicemail, it picked up a male and female that can be heard, and it's presumed that it was Denson and Danniella. The podcast case file, the voicemail can actually be heard at the 55-minute, 15-second part of the podcast. I did listen to that podcast. I am doing this with my own notes rather than, well, I did take some notes from there, but, and then there was a second voicemail that was left on the messenger that was also seemed to be unintentional, of a male and female that are also presumed to be Denson and Danniella. And it's not really clear whether the female voice heard in the second audio is the same female voice as the first audio clip. And that voicemail can be heard at 55:55 on Casefile Podcast. Mallory, she ends up going over to Ollie's, and she meets up with Randy, and they're waiting for Danniella and Denson to arrive. And Denson finally calls Randy back at 11:15 and explains that Danniella lost her phone and he was going back to Dublin's to look for it. And then at about 11:30, both vehicles end up leaving the Shell station and turning towards Dublin's. Danniella is following Denson for a while before she turns around and goes towards a more populated part of town. And it's really not known whether Danniella was actually driving her car. As seen on the surveillance video, detectives state that she had only been seen occupying her vehicle. So Denson gets back to Dublin's, and he sends Mallory a text containing a selfie of himself inside the bar of Dublin's with the caption, "Getting phone, just got back here, but somehow lost a Danniella." Well, a server had actually found Daniella's phone on the back of a car in the parking lot, and he put it behind the bar for safekeeping, and Denson retrieves the phone from the server. Now, this is where things get really, really weird, because Denson has Daniella's phone, so he attempts to call Danniella via Facebook, but receives no answer. Since she had no way to answer the call, obviously she wasn't going to answer it. And then he writes to her on Facebook Messenger, "Call me, Dublin had your phone." Okay, he has her phone. She's not going to be able to answer her phone if he has it. Well, Denson decides to join Mallory and Randy at Ollie's, and he tells them Danniella hadn't shown up yet. So Denson attempts to call Danniella again, for a second time by video Facebook Messenger. And again, he gets no answer. He has her phone. She's not going to answer it. So the third time he tries to do a video call, Denson ends up asking Randy, "Well, what do I do with her phone?" Well, Randy tells him to take it to P.F. Chang's so that Danniella can get it at her next shift. Denson leaves Ollie's and he takes Daniella's phone with him. Now, the next morning at 7:30, Hannah texts Danniella to see if she's okay, but she never receives an answer. That next day, Tyler calls Danniella from jail the next day, and at this point, Denson still has Daniella's phone, and he answers it, telling Tyler that he'd found the cell phone in a parking lot. Well, Tyler gives Denson Julie's number, so Julie can get the phone. Well, Denson calls Julie and tells her that he'd found Daniella's phone, but didn't mention that he was with her the night before or that he even knew her. So Julie told him to drop the phone off at P.F. Chang's. And Julie ended up getting a hold to Danniella's landlord to put a note on her door saying that her phone was at work. Later in the day, several hours later, Julie goes over and checks the apartment, and the note is on the door, but it hasn't been touched. And Julie is assuming that Danniella just partied it up a little too hard the night before. She's sleeping it off at a friend's. But on the 19th, nobody had still heard or seen from Danniella. So the 19th, Patrick and Cora they'd gotten back from their week-long visiting Patrick's family, and everyone was catching up on their trip, but Danniella wasn't there to greet her daughter, and Danniella had already had plans on doing this. So Julie messages Danniella via Facebook Messenger, and now Julie's really worried, and she continues checking for a response, but the message went unviewed, and the Facebook was showing that Danniella hadn't been active in 2 days. So Julie then, she posts a message on Danniella's public wall asking her to get in touch with her. Later that evening, Hannah is still trying to message Danniella, and Hannah's not getting any response. So Hannah starts calling friends to see if anyone has heard from Danniella since Tuesday night, and no one had, but an unknown mutual friend had said that they had seen Danniella at Heroes Tuesday night. So Hannah calls Heroes and asks the manager to check the parking lot for Danniella's car. But Danniella's car is not there, and the manager offers to check the schedule to see who was working that night. And the manager calls back Hannah and says that Randy confirmed Danniella had been at Heroes and that she had been hanging out with Denson and Mallory. So Hannah contacts Denson, but she didn't really know him, but she finds him on Facebook. And she sends him a message asking if he knew any information about Danniella or where she may be. So Denson sees the message that Hannah left for him on Facebook, and he calls Hannah and lets him know that he hasn't really seen Danniella since Tuesday night, but that he had her phone and he's been trying to get in contact with her so he can return it. Even though he has talked to Randy and to Julie, and both of them have told him to take the phone back to PJ Chang's. So that evening on the 19th, Hannah goes over to Danniella's apartment because she had a spare key, and she goes in and finds no sign of Danniella that has been there. So on the 20th, Hannah messages Danniella again on Facebook, and no answer. And this is while Hannah's on her way to her cosmetology class. And on the 20th, Danniella was supposed to show up for work, and she was a no-show. And it wasn't like it wasn't like Danniella not to show up for work. So Hannah calls Julie and messages Denson. By this time, there's been no sign of Danniella by any of them. And after a bunch of calls and messages between the three of them, they decide they're going to report her missing. So Julie and Denson, they meet at the police station, and so that Julie can file a missing persons report, and Denson can hand over the phone to make a statement. Well, when they get there, they are told they are to go to the government building location where the missing persons department was housed. Well, on the way there, Julie calls Hannah to get the 6-digit passcode for Danniella's phone so that she could check her messages and calls over the last week. Well, Hannah lets Julie know that Danniella's password is her employee ID number, and she gives her the number. So Julie, Denson, and Hannah, they all give the police statements about Tuesday night. And Hannah gives a statement about how out of character it was for Danniella not to contact and not to show up for work. And Julie gives as much information as she could, and she handed over Danniella's phone to the police department. So that afternoon on the 20th of July, the police department and Julie head over to Danniella's apartment along with the crime scene technicians. And once they're in Danniella's apartment, they conduct an assessment, but nothing seems to be missing or out of the ordinary. So later that afternoon, Julie had Danniella's Facebook login information, which was stored on Julie's computer, and she logs into Danniella's Facebook account, and she finds several missed phone calls and those 2 voicemails from Denson. And she turns these over to the police department, and they advise her not to go back into Danniella's account so that they could ensure no evidence was tampered with. So Julie asks them about potential CCTV footage from various locations, but she's told that there's no footage had been found. But to Julie's surprise, a few days later, the local news station aired the footage that was captured on surveillance cameras from the Shell station where Danniella's car last pinged. And then she contacts the police again about it, and instead of responding to Julie, the police actually get a hold of the news station and they demand that they remove it, which the station did, but they left up the timeline. So remember that moment where I made the comment about, spoiler alert, so July 24th, Julie and Patrick, they went to the court hearing for Cora, and since Danniella didn't show up for it, and she was allegedly missing, she was obviously unable to attend the hearing, and Julie and Patrick were awarded full custody of Cora. The next day, Tyler is released from jail, and he goes straight over to the apartment that him and Danniella had shared, but Danniella pretty much had the apartment. And he took any item of value, such as like the video game systems, and he pawned them off. Well, Julie found out about this, and she went to the pawn shop and bought the items back. Also on the 25th, Danniella's case was handed over to the homicide department, but there really had no evidence whether a homicide had actually occurred or not. And on the 26th, the police stated that there was no evidence of foul play in Danniella's disappearance. So it's hard to say why it was handed over to the homicide department. On the 27th, Hannah goes back to Danniella's apartment with the key that she had to see if anything was unusual, and Hannah noted that all of Danniella's possessions were still there. That evening, there was a candlelight vigil that was held at the Medal of Honor Park near Danniella's apartment, and this was the park that she would go to with Cora frequently. While the detectives were searching Danniella's apartment, they had noted that on the whiteboard, she had her goals written down and she had money saved. And according to the note, she had saved about $1,200, but there was no official record of the money ever being found in the apartment. And since Tyler was unable to actually maintain the apartment, the rent on the apartment, And he was evicted, and the building manager would no longer allow Julie to collect Danniella's possessions. And instead, they dumped all of her possessions on the sidewalk for Julie to collect. In August, a tip and info blog was announcing a reward by the mobile police department that any information into Danniella's disappearance, there was an award that was now $2,000. Well, on September 14th, there was an arrest of a Jason Dykes, who happened to be Julie's nephew. He was arrested on charges of domestic violence, strangulation, assault, and unlawful imprisonment. The alleged victim had claimed that he had said something threatening about Danniella. Well, after raids of the property, no evidence related to Danniella or her disappearance was ever found, and the allegations were later proven to be false, and all the charges against Jason were cleared, and he was cleared of being any person of interest in Danniella's investigation of her disappearance. So Julie gets really frustrated pretty quick with the lack of information and the lack of investigation. So she starts a GoFundMe, and she uses the funds to raise to print flyers and to post and pass around. She also has billboards posted featuring Danniella's photo and details about her disappearance. In October of 2018, another candlelight vigil. March of 19, there was a candlelight vigil at the same park, the Medal of Honor Park, in honor of Danniella's 26th birthday. So now, April of 2019, and there was a dive training that was going on, and the dive team decided to go into an off-duty police officer mapped out areas for the dive training team in Saraland, Alabama, which was approximately 17 miles north of where Danniella was last seen. So they went approximately 20 to 30 feet down near a public boat launch located in a residential area, and it marked it for the dive team to investigate during training. Well, while they're doing their training, they actually discovered a dark blue 2014 Chevy Cruze with a Pearl Motors tag that happened to have human remains in it. And since there were human remains that were found in the vehicle, the dive team basically left everything underwater to consult with investigators on what they needed to do to appropriately remove and preserve any evidence while with removal. So the law enforcement, they stated they would be treating the case as a homicide until the final determination from the autopsy could be performed. So on May 3rd, they removed the Chevy Cruze and they drained it on site. Other than damage to the front panels on both sides, the car was actually in relatively good condition, and the car and the remains had been transferred to a secured facility. It was determined that by the Mobile Police Department that the Chevy Cruze did belong to Danniella, and that the remains that were found in the vehicle were that of an adult female. However, they couldn't determine whether that adult female was Danniella quite yet. They were going to wait until the autopsy and DNA would confirm that. They couldn't say exactly how long the vehicle had been in the water, and they couldn't say whether it had been pushed or driven in, or a confirmation of the position the body was found or the state that the investigators would be unlikely to determine the location of the body when the vehicle entered the water. So on the 5th, Julie tells the press that she really does believe that the body found in the car is Danniella's. However, the Mobile Police Department had not confirmed that it was Danniella yet, but all the signs had pointed to that it was. And there was a quote by Julie that states, "You think it is going to be closure to finally find out because that is your goal, to find her. That's what you've been working so hard for so long for, begging for and praying for, and when you finally get that, it's not closure," said Julie. At the boat launch on May 10th, the family held another candlelight vigil for Danniella, since they were pretty much requesting help trying to figure out any information on what may have happened to Danniella that night and how she ended up in there. So on the 14th, the autopsy and toxicology results came back and they were inconclusive, but there was some reveals to certain manipulations that were inside the vehicle that indicated that Danniella may have been alive when the car entered the water, such as her car was put in park. The keys were in the ignition, but it wasn't turned on. Her emergency brake was engaged. The doors were locked, and her rear driver's seat window was down about 2 inches. And it's really unknown on whether or not Danniella was pushed in or she drove the vehicle into the water. But they decided that her death was ruled undetermined. And according to her mother, Joy, she had released a statement stating that Bill and I have been notified that the homicide unit at this point is leaning towards an accident. We are heartbroken and devastated about these findings. Danniella's father and I still have hope in the homicide division due to the fact that they have not closed the case and it's still ongoing. There is yet to be a positive ID of our daughter Danniella Vian. Please continue to keep our daughter Danniella in your prayers. Thank you, Joy and Bill Vian. Oh, in June of 2020, Danniella's Chevy Cruze was auctioned off to a Ukrainian company for parts, and it was presumed that it was auctioned off by the insurance company, and it was shipped off to this Ukrainian company, and it was sold for $25. But it indicated that the keys to the vehicle had not been sent, and that the vehicle had sustained flood damage. But the photos of the interior of the car had also shown the back passenger seatbelt had been completely moved, which was never previously mentioned by the investigators. And it really at no point does it state that it was Danniella in the vehicle. It is presumed to be Danniella. There have been many vigils in Danniella's memory, and as of March 8th, 2021, on Danniella's 28th birthday, friends gathered at the Medal of Honor Park on Danniella's birthday and they had received permission to plant a tree in Danniella's honor there. And on May 27th, 2022, the Alabama Cold Case Advocacy Organization featured Danniella in a petition to introduce a new Alabama Victims and Families Rights Act, where the law basically provides additional resources to overworked and understaffed law enforcement agencies to increase corporations between the families and law enforcement, and to give Alabama's families the assistance that they'd need and want for their own family decreasing the cold case backlog and to increase the clearance rate for families like Danniella's. And that has been the case of Danniella Nickole Vian. I hope you guys all have a great week. I will be going in to have surgery next week. So my plan is to hopefully have some pre-recordings done. So for the next few weeks, I'm not leaving you guys behind. If you do not get a recording in the next 2 weeks, I am just very sore from my surgery and have not been able to get into my office to have it done. Love you guys. Talk to you guys soon. Bye.